Hey everyone, it's time for another piano questions answered tutorial, and this one is actually going to be in two parts because we're covering a fairly epic subject. Now, the original question came in from Chris, who said, can I suggest a tutorial explaining the way jazz chord symbols are notated, please? Because I still find the variety of different ways the same chord can be written as a symbol confusing even after years of playing. Now, that's a really good question from Chris because I use chord symbols a lot on the channel, and this is a good opportunity to dig into how they work, their purpose, their limitations, okay, and also to try to make sense of some of the confusing or ambiguous chord symbols that you might come across. But as I say, it's such a big topic, I'm actually going to split this tutorial in two. In part one, I'm going to talk about chord notation in general and go through some of the more common problems and sources of confusion that you might come across. Major 7 chords, major 9 chords and their various extensions, and plus diminished and augmented chords. And then in the next tutorial, which hopefully will come out about a week after this one, I'm going to look at things like sus and add chords and some of the more weird and wonderful stuff you might come across, like alt chords, quartals, quintals, that sort of thing. Now, rather than just focusing on jazz, I'm going to think about what we might call jazz and pop chord symbols across the board, and I'll tell you exactly what I mean by those terms in a second. Now, this isn't a tutorial for absolute beginners, yeah? I'm going to assume that you know what most or all of the chords I'm going to talk about actually are and how to play them, and also that you understand some common music theory concepts like intervals. If you're a little bit shaky on your chord knowledge and your music theory and so on, that's no problem. Stick around and watch this tutorial anyway, but when we're done, go and check out some of my other tutorials that cover the basics, okay? Especially all the basic piano chords in one epic tutorial. You can search for that video, or I'll include a link in the description text below. First things first, let me show you exactly what I mean when I use the term chord symbols. Often when people think of chord symbols, they think it means stuff like this, okay? But actually, there are two types of chord notation, what we might call number symbols and letter symbols. Number symbols use Roman numerals, yeah? And in general, lowercase Roman numerals are used for minor chords and uppercase Roman numerals are used for major chords. And also you can add things to the end of your Roman numerals to show that you're developing or changing the chord in some way. I'm mentioning number symbols pretty much for the sake of completeness. We're not going to deal with them in that much detail in this tutorial, but I want to mention them because they often crop up in discussions of harmony. For example, you might hear people talk about 2, 5, 1 progressions. And number symbols are useful when we're talking about harmony in general terms because they are independent of key. So a 2, 5, 1 progression in the key of C major is D minor, G and C. But in the key of F major, it's G minor, C and F. Okay, so Roman numerals really useful if we're kind of talking about things in the abstract. But let's put them to one side because the type of chord symbol we're really interested in here is the sort of chord symbol that we use in concrete practice, which is the letter symbol. Now, when people talk about pop chord notation or jazz chord notation, it's letter symbols that they usually mean. Stuff like G7 and E flat minor. Now, the way letter symbols work is actually quite straightforward. Yeah, at the start of the symbol, we have the root note of the chord, okay, the note that the chord is based on. And if it stands alone without any sort of suffix, it just means it's a straightforward major chord made up of 3 notes. So that just represents the chord of C major, which is the notes C, E and G, okay, played in any sort of combination, but it's a straightforward C major chord. Now, if that single letter has a suffix, that changes it in some way. So if we have a lowercase m straight after it, that means it's the chord of C minor. Okay, any combination of the notes C, E flat and G. Likewise, if we have, say, the letter G and it has a 7 after it, that means it's the chord of G7. Okay, okay, the notes G, B, D and F in any number of repetitions, doublings, in any sort of configuration on the piano keyboard. And there are various others. So today we're going to look at suffixes like dim, D-I-M, for diminished chords and so on. That's the basic idea though. So you have the root note of the chord and maybe a suffix indicating that it's something other than a straightforward major chord. And some of those suffixes are what we're going to be talking about today. Now, the fundamental problem we have to deal with when we work with this kind of chord notation is that there isn't a single agreed standard. It's quite an informal system that's grown up over the last century or so, and the way it has grown up has led to several types of chord being written in more than one way, especially once we get away from the basic, major chords and minor chords. And there are several kinds of different traditions. So jazz musicians, for example, tend to write, as we'll see, major seventh chords like this. Okay, C with a triangle after it, whereas someone who's more oriented around the world of pop or rock or show music or whatever is more likely to do it like that, C, M-A-J, 7. There isn't one right way of doing it, but the different ways of doing it do cause confusion, and they actually cause quite a lot of arguments. Lots of people insist that their way is the right way or the best way or whatever, and guaranteed once I've posted this video, lots of people turn up in the comments and say, oh no, that's right and that's wrong, and there's only one right way of doing it. And the truth is, the way you notate chords is often down to your personal taste, and the most important thing is that the chord symbols you're using achieve their aim, which is that the person reading them understands them clearly. As long as they do that, that's fine. Yeah, it's okay to have the variation to use different symbols. So this isn't going to be a comprehensive guide to every weird bit of chord notation you'll come across, but what I want to do now is have a look at some of the most common sources of confusion in chord notation. So regular major and minor chords and seventh chords and so on are fairly straightforward and don't often cause confusion. Very, very occasionally you'll see someone notate a simple major chord with the letters M-A-J. So you'll see something like C-M-A-J for C major, but that's quite unusual, and often if you do see that, there's a very specific reason for it, which we might come on to in the second part of this tutorial. If there's no indicator of tonality after the chord, it just means it's a major chord. If it were a minor chord, it would have an M after it. If it were a seventh or something like that, there would be something there to say so. Now, our first source of confusion is the major seventh chord, okay, which, as I hope you know, is a basic major triad with an added major seventh. And in a pop context, you'll usually see it written like this, C-M-A-J-7, C-Maj-7. But in a jazz context, it's often, but not always, written like this, C with a triangle after it, or C with a triangle and a 7. Very occasionally, you'll see this, C-M-A-7, and they're all referring to the same chord, C major 7, the notes C, E, G and B played in whatever combination on the piano keyboard. Do also watch out for this thing, C''M'7, which is a very old school way of notating a C major 7 chord. The logic is that in Roman numeral notation you use a lowercase letter for minor stuff and an uppercase letter for major stuff. So C lowercase m7 is C minor 7 and C uppercase m is C major 7. I just think that's horribly confusing, and you should definitely avoid doing that, but do keep an eye out for it sometimes, especially if you're looking at old jazz lead sheets. If it's a capital M, that could indicate a major 7 chord. Anyway, probably the most common form you'll see, especially in printed chord progressions and online, because the triangle's hard to produce on a keyboard, is C-M-A-J-7, C-Maj-7. And I actually like that one best because I think it's the clearest expression of the chord. Kind of closely related are major 9ths, 11ths, 13ths and all the rest. They usually work exactly the same way, but with a different number added. So C major 9, C major 11, C major 13, whatever. Again, I think spelling the whole thing out, C Maj 9, C Maj 13, is the clearest way of notating the chords, because it really helps to differentiate, for example, a C major 9 chord from a C minor 9 or a C9, which we'll come to in a second. One important thing to say about these heavily extended chords like 11ths and 13ths is that they are obviously difficult to play in one hand, so often, as you may know, notes are missed out. So for example, in jazz practice in particular, a C major 13 chord might be played something like this. Okay, a single C in the bass, then E, G, A and D in the right hand. Now the full chord also contains a B and an F, okay, but we're missing those out. And if you wanted to specify that you're missing them out in your notation, you could use the word omit and write something like C major 13 omit E and B, or omit 3rd and 7th, just in brackets after the chord like this. But, and here's another really important point about chord symbols, and we'll come back to it, if chord notation is getting so complex that it's hard to read, it kind of defeats the point of using it in the first place. Chord notation should, above all, be clear and efficient. If it's more clear and efficient to write a grand staff out with treble and bass clef and to score out your progression, do that instead. Okay, on to minor 7th chords. Now, like major 7th chords, they are notated in a variety of ways. The most common way, and I think the best, is this, CM7. But you'll also come across this, CMIN7, and sometimes you'll even come across this, C-7. Now the whole minus symbol thing follows a system whereby that minus symbol is used instead of the letter M or the abbreviation MIN for minor. And I'll be honest, I think it looks terrible and offers pretty major potential for confusion, okay? So if I were you, stay away from the minus symbol for indicating minor and stick to CM7 for your C minor 7 chord. Larger extensions like ninths, C minor 9, C minor 11, they just follow the same pattern, okay? Don't get them mixed up with the regular 9 chord, C9. There's C9, as you can see, it's basically a C7 chord with a 9 added, and that is almost universally notated like this. In fact, I've never seen anything different, okay? So just like C7 is simple, so is C9. Same with C11, it all follows the same pattern. A general point, by the way, just something to mention, is that sometimes you'll see chord suffixes written in the same font size as the chord letter, like this, and sometimes as a superscript, like this. Now, whether it's the same size or superscript makes no difference to the way you play the chord. It's just a style that some people and some publishers use. Also some applications. So if you create chord notation in an application like Sibelius, for example, you'll probably have noticed that it's kind of out of the box standard is to use superscript. It doesn't mean anything, it is just a style thing. Next up, we have diminished and augmented chords. I'm going to deal with diminished chords first because they often cause a little bit of confusion, as we'll see. There are two basic types of diminished chord, as you probably know. We have the 3-note ordinary diminished chord, there's F diminished, and then we have the 4-note diminished 7th, there's F diminished 7. Whether you call it diminished 7, diminished 7th, doesn't really matter. I tend to use them interchangeably. Now, I think the clearest and most readable way of notating those chords, especially if you're handwriting, is with the letters D-I-M. So for example, F dim for F diminished and F dim 7 for F diminished 7th. But another way that you will see used, and which I use sometimes in fact, is to use the degree symbol. So F degree symbol for F diminished, F degree symbol 7 for F diminished 7th, and so on. That's fine, I use that, but as I say, but when you're handwriting in particular, I think dim is just slightly clearer. The big problem arises when we come across this thing, the degree symbol with a slash through it. Now, that's used for notating the so-called half diminished seventh chord. Now, a half diminished seventh chord is the same as a diminished seventh, so there's a regular diminished 7 with a C diminished 7, but the half diminished doesn't have the diminished seventh. It just has a regular minor 7 like a C7 or a C minor 7 chord. I think this is hugely problematic. First of all, the degree symbol with a slash through it is hard to read. It's easy to mistake for a regular diminished chord, okay? And also the half diminished seventh, and this will annoy a lot of jazz people, but I don't think it makes much sense. What's the point of calling it, any sort of diminished seventh chord if the seventh isn't diminished? A much easier and clearer way of notating that chord, to my mind, is to call it C minor 7 flat 5. So there's your regular C minor 7 with a flattened fifth. Easier to read, more descriptive, better all round. Yes, it maybe takes a little bit longer to write out, but generally I would always notate that chord as CM7 flat 5 rather than messing around with this sort of half diminished seventh business, which I think is confusing. Slightly related to diminished chords are augmented chords. Okay, there is C and there is C augmented. Augmented chords are much simpler to notate, and you would usually notate that as C followed by an AUG, C aug, or C augmented, or just with a plus symbol, C plus. I think they're both pretty clear. You might remember that I'm quite down on minus symbols to indicate minor chords, but I think the plus symbol is quite clear and pretty universally recognised as notating a diminished chord. Sometimes you will see people write things like C augmented 7 and they mean something like that. That risks causing a little bit of confusion, okay, because it's not the 7 you're augmenting, you're just adding a B flat to an augmented chord. I would be tempted to notate that as something else, something like C7 sharp 5th, C7 flat 6, C7 flat 13th, something like that. Yeah, I would tend to avoid the C augmented 7 just for the sake of clarity, but that's really a matter of taste. You will find other people doing that differently. Okay, so that's it for part 1 of this two-parter, and I'll be back before long with the second part, in which, as I said, we'll have a look at some of the more exotic, weird and wonderful chord symbols that you might come across. I should say thanks very much to Chris for the question. Chris actually does a ton of interesting stuff as an instrument maker, kind of with an interest in old school electronics and making musical instruments from reclaimed materials. Do check out Chris's YouTube channel and his Etsy store. I'll include a link below and also maybe in a YouTube card or something at the side. He does really cool stuff worth having a look at. As usual, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. The red button is down there, and check out my Patreon crowdfunder at patreon.com/Bill Hilton, and of course my books, especially How to Really Play the Piano, the stuff your teacher never taught you, and maybe my Introduction to Cocktail Piano and 7 Studies in Pop Piano, which quite a few people seem to really like. Again, the links are below and in cards on the right and such like. As I say, I'll be back soon with more chord symbols. I'll see you then.